To talk about one of our specific reform efforts, Ambassador Nancy Soderberg, currently president of the Connect U.S. Fund and former U.S. ambassador to the UN, is here to share that information with you. She has served in the U.S. Senate, the White House, and the United Nations, and has a deep understanding of policymaking and negotiations at the highest level of the U.S. government and the UN. In 1997, President Bill Clinton appointed her to serve as the alternate representative to the UN as a presidential appointee with the rank of ambassador. From 1993 to 97, she served as the third-ranking official of the National Security Council at the White House as Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. She was responsible for day-to-day crisis management, briefing the President, and developing U.S. national security policy. And we are privileged to have her work with us in this reform effort. Thanks. Ambassador Soderberg.
Well, thank you very much, Kay, and thank all of you for coming to learn more about this important issue. I really have to say, Kay, I paid great tribute to the Charity and Security Network for all the work that you do. We need more champions of freedom out there to try and eliminate barriers to important charitable work. So thank you very much. I encourage all of you to take a look at the principles. I also want to thank Naz for not only moderating this discussion, but for your work at Harvard and before that at Human Rights Watch. As you all are aware and have heard quite a bit about this morning, or this afternoon, I guess by now, the material support provisions of U.S. law make it extremely difficult for NGOs and private individuals to help resolve costly and deadly conflicts, and that simply just does not make sense. For many years, these players have played critical roles in paving the way for peace by developing dialogues between sworn enemies, by showing combatants that there are alternatives to violence, by demonstrating that peace is not a zero-sum game, and by showing them that there is a broad community prepared to help them with any necessary and always difficult transition. I saw this role firsthand as an advisor to President Bill Clinton as he sought to use the influence of the United States in convincing the IRA in Northern Ireland to end its violence in the 1990s. And quite frankly, the U.S. and the British government lacked the contacts with the key grassroots groups and, frankly, the imagination to grasp the change that was underway within the IRA. And it was only the groups that had direct contact with and the confidence of the IRA here and in Northern Ireland who both understood the chance for peace and had the influence to push the IRA to make that transformation. And had those private individuals and NGOs involved in that peace process not had that right, and I do consider it a right, to engage with the IRA leadership, peace would have certainly been delayed. And what that means in practical terms is that another 200 to 300 people would have died each year because of that delay. But because you had peace, you had an end to the deaths that were being caused each year by that violence. But today, the conflict resolution process, those very experts would be prohibited from helping build that peace. The June Supreme Court decision of last year, Holder versus the Humanitarian Law Project, upheld the application of laws that would criminalize these types of activities. However, the court did defer to Congress and the executive branch to make judgments about the scope of the prohibition because national security issues are involved. In other words, the court held that the law may impose such restrictions, not that it must. And Congress has in turn deferred to the Secretary of State through a statutory provision that empowers her to exempt expert advice and assistance, training, and personnel from material support prohibitions when she finds that these activities will not further terrorism. And I would argue that clearly activities directly aimed at preventing or resolving conflicts would clearly fit that criteria. And today we're passing out a letter to Hillary Clinton, which we sent last month, calling on her to use this authority to exempt these activities from that prohibition. And without such recourse, without such a course correction, the opportunities to end violence certainly will be lost. Multi-track diplomacy and peacebuilding do not pose a threat to our national security. In fact, they strengthen it. As you look at the signatories of this letter, it's a bipartisan letter, includes an impressive array of former public officials, including 3 ambassadors, respected academics, leaders in conflict prevention and resolution field, human rights and humanitarian groups. In total, it's 18 organizations and 27 prominent individuals. They have strong credentials in the field of conflict prevention and national security, and they understand that we are missing opportunities for peace. Nathan described a couple of these missed opportunities, particularly with Hamas. Let me just go through a couple more that you'll see in some of the appendix to the letter. In Sri Lanka, for instance, in 2010, the former Sri Lankan ambassador to the U.S. approached the Alliance for Peacebuilding with a proposal to assemble a task force that would bring various groups together. But because one of them, the LTTE, was listed as a foreign terrorist organization, the project could not be pursued. Trying to reach out to the Taliban in Afghanistan, the 3D Security Network, and in the Eastern Mennonite University have been hampered. Violent groups in the Philippines are not being engaged by the American Friends Service Committee. Other groups are trying to encourage action with Hamas, the Africa Action Group, USIP. The U.S. government's own support to help bring Nepalese advisors to talks in New Delhi were complicated by this, and the project in times of transitions work in Colombia was a lost opportunity. I would encourage you to take a look at the practical examples of the impact of this law. And having been in the business of conflict prevention for decades, it's clear to me that these types of activities are directly in the interest of the United States government and should be exempt from this provision. And in the letter, we urge Secretary Clinton to take advantage of the powers granted to her in the exemption and work out the language that we've suggested in that law. If you look, there's a draft letter exemption language that we propose here that would very clearly exempt any kind of activities in the peacebuilding realm from this provision. The letter also calls on the Secretary to consult with the Attorney General, and clearly the Justice Department has a role in this. And we'll be discussing both with the State Department and the Justice Department steps they could take to enable groups here to be able to conduct this important activities. For instance, the Justice Department has the authority to issue prosecutorial guidelines that make clear it will not prosecute this type of activity. So there's a range of ways the U.S. government could respond to this. But we're hopeful that this letter will spur a discussion within the administration and encourage the Secretary of State to use her statutory authority to guarantee that non-governmental organizations and individuals will be able to do the job of making the world a safer and more peaceful place. And thank you again to Kay for this important morning. And